I am a really big true crime fan. And so I watch fraud documentaries all the time. And every single fraud case involves documents, you guys. Every
Yeah.
single one. Welcome back to Good Question, your favorite podcast where we ask the big questions shaping the future of fraud, AI, and trust. I'm Brianna Valleskey, head of marketing here at Inscribe, and today I want to talk about something that's been making waves across the AI world and the fraud world. Recently, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, made a statement that definitely caught our attention. In an interview with the Federal Reserve, he said, quote, "I am very nervous that we have an impending significant fraud crisis." He went on to explain that AI is now capable of defeating most existing forms of authentication. And what's coming next, he says, is AI-generated videos and content that are indistinguishable from reality. So today, I'm very excited to be joined by our co-founders here at Inscribe to unpack what all of this means for risk teams and what the future of fraud and fraud prevention look like in a world with pervasive, easily accessible generative AI. First, we're joined by Ronan. He's our CEO. He's been in the fraud prevention trenches for almost a decade, working closely with financial institutions and risk teams, and is a leading advocate for the use of AI in fraud prevention. Ronan, it is a pleasure to have you back.
Great to be here. Excited to have the conversation today.
And then we also have Conor, our CTO at Inscribe. He's the architect behind the AI systems we're going to be talking about today and spends most of his time thinking about how to make machines actually helpful and not just powerful. Conor, it is great to have you back on the show as well.
Thanks, Brie.
So let's start with this quote from Sam Altman. He said his number one concern right now is an AI fraud crisis. That really stuck with me. And Ronan, I want to start with your take here. How does that track with what we're seeing in the field?
I think he has said something which we've been seeing for quite a while. And so it was good to see it get, that level of awareness and, bring more folks into the conversation. But for the past 2 or so years, we have seen the fraud landscape change quite a bit. And in particular, the use of AI to increase the volume, velocity, and variety of fraud that can occur. So yeah, fraudsters can really do a lot more damage than they were used to. And, ultimately, I think once leaders in various different industries see this coming, I think they'll also have a similar response to Sam where they'll be like, wow, we need to start ringing the alarm bells here a little bit more. And it's not just, about the volume, velocity, and variety. It's also the quality of this fraud as well. It's just improving at a rate that nobody really expected. So, it's no longer the use of Photoshop and, a bit of modification with text editors. It's ground up creation of new documents, the creation of fabricated and false transaction data, very comprehensive uses there. So yeah, it's at the beginning of a new era. So, whether or not we would call it a crisis is up for debate, but it's certainly, something more folks need to be talking about.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why we wanted to explore the topic today. You alluded to it a little bit in what you said, but I want to dig in. What does this mean for high trust industries like financial services that rely on documents as artifacts of trust?
Yeah, what's interesting about it is it just makes everything worse. So companies today who have fraud exposure already lose money today to fraudsters, but they also spend a lot of time reviewing information from customers, some of which are fraudsters. But ultimately with AI, what it means is more fraud losses, more time spent manually reviewing data, and more pressure on ops teams. And then ultimately all that cost would pass on to customers, either through more expensive products or poorer customer experience. And so, the answer here that could solve this is having solutions that tackle this. So the fight, either side is more of a level playing field. And that's what we aim to do at Inscribe. But yeah, we need to kind of, as an industry or fraud vendors, need to stay ahead of the fraudsters.
I couldn't agree more. It is a cat and mouse game. And whenever there's a sort of new innovation or technology being used by fraudsters, I think we'd always urge fraud fighters and fraud vendors to explore that technology as well to see how it can be used for fraud prevention. Conor, can you talk about what we're actually seeing on the ground with AI-generated documents?
Yeah, this has been a surprise for us too at Inscribe. seen around a 200% increase in the number of hit rates on AI generated fraud over the last couple of months. And these aren't easy to spot. These have, bypassed our systems originally and bypassed our customer systems and their manual review teams. So it was really important for us to be able to catch these. And what's interesting about a lot of these AI generated documents today is that they do leave behind artifacts that we can use to catch them. So whether it is the, simple artifacts like the size of the image, a lot of the common AI generated tools output images in the same format, and that's a very easy telltale sign. Other artifacts can include the use of dummy data, leaving behind metadata traces, and watermarks within the image. So all these together can give us clues as to whether it was AI generated or not. And it's been effective as an initial defense, but we believe we'll have to continue adding to our repertoire of detectors to catch this to stay ahead.
That's a great point to end on there too, because I think even since the spring, when we saw the release of the new GPT image models and there was all the Studio Ghibli imagery, the first fake documents we saw were like, okay, but how quickly the sophistication and like realness of them has improved in just a few months is like very noteworthy. Ronan, broad question for you. If fraud is now generative AI powered, does that mean fraud detection and prevention can or even needs to be generative AI powered too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Gen AI can and likely needs to be used to defend against Gen AI powered fraud. But I also think it's worth noting that I think Gen AI would be used in the defenses, even if the fraudsters weren't using it. It's just a very helpful tool that can be used in many ways. And over the past 18 months to 2 years, we have seen lots of various different initial use cases, starting out with summarization. So we know fraud and ops teams generally have lots of information from various different sources. And so summarizing all that information and giving it in a very digestible format to an end user was one very helpful use case that became possible over 18 months now. And then after that, we also had web search emerge as a helpful use of LLMs, where you could use like Anthropic's computer use model or any of their web search products to go out into the internet, perform research on businesses, individuals, addresses, connections between them, adverse media, and a whole host of other non-prescribed sources to find signal on fraudsters. And then, of course, we have the use of LLMs just enhancing lots of individual building blocks, such as classification models, parsing models. These are foundational tools for fraud teams and fraud solutions. And so LLMs have really helped there. But ultimately, I think the largest potential impact and use of Gen AI for fraud teams will be with agentic systems, or, fraud reasoning systems, as they're becoming known as now, where these systems will be able to investigate like a human would. And that just promises a huge uplift in terms of fraud performance.
I want to extol on the virtues of documents. Document authentication is one of the most complex and manual forms of fraud detection. Documents are semi-structured. They vary by institution. They carry both visual and textual and perceptual signal. Everyone has a different fingerprint. And what is interesting about document fraud is that it requires a deep understanding of each document type and format, as well as additional applicant context. So, an LLM has to ask, like, does this pay stub match this person's history? Does the payroll align with the business size? Is this metadata consistent? And the variety is endless, of course. So there's hundreds of formats, and our system has to parse them, validate them, reason about their authenticity. That's not something like a simple tool or rule can do. So, Conor, with that, I want to hear from you, like, how we got here. Can you give us a quick overview of Inscribe's history with document fraud, and then more recently, that journey with LLMs over the last 18 months?
Yeah, this has been really interesting. And if we take it all the way back to 2018, when we got started, this was really when, the world was obsessed with computer vision and ImageNet and so on. And, at Inscribe, we were very focused on supervised machine learning models. So this is where we'd identify a type of fraud that our customers were experiencing in their data set. We'd gather as many examples of those as we could. And then we tried to build either like rules-based detectors or, picking a machine learning model and doing a supervised training run on that data using that model. And this is kind of like a very traditional process that we at Inscribe used for many years, and pretty much in many cases is a standard in today's industry for fraud detection. However, when ChatGPT came out and, the transformer based architecture from Google started to take off in 2018, 19, 2020, we started moving more into the world of natural language based detectors. So these like new capabilities were emerging around natural language that were like much more effective than what was previously possible. And, as other companies started figuring out use cases, we started asking the same question at Inscribe: how could we use these? So initially using large language models for like summarizing findings or understanding the context behind the areas of a document that were tampered with. So knowing that this piece of information is like a benign terms and conditions that might have been tampered with, therefore it may be a false positive, versus this is an account detail that is it's a critical piece of information. Then, fast forwarding a little bit, the industry started taking a lot of interest in web search and like this idea that you can have agents scouring the web for new data sources. This was, again, a super interesting avenue for us on the fraud side. There's lots of information on the web that can be used to enrich our understanding of a customer or company. So we explore that. And then a bit like Ronan hinted at earlier, we're now really thinking more about, okay, beyond just the simple tasks of summarization or reading websites, can we actually use some of the underlying reasoning abilities or thinking abilities of a large language model to act more like a human? So can it plan a course of action to catch fraud on a document and then carry out that plan by calling on various tools and various data points and contexts to come up with a conclusion? So it's been a fascinating journey, adapting and staying ahead with all the latest like research and technical breakthroughs on the large language model side. And, the Inscribe, we're definitely trying to push the boundaries of what's possible and finding the best use cases every week.
I think in terms of the conversation on what's an agentic system, it is very interesting. And I think the industry's understanding of this has changed over time, and like the bar that needs to be hit has changed too. And so like, I think at one extreme, like there are some folks out there calling an agentic system anything that uses an LLM, even if it's, simply like summarization or like, knowledge retrieval. And like, so it's not taking any actions by itself. It's not creating a plan. It's not iterating based on feedback or what it learns during a task. Then we have other folks like they have like a chat experience, like a conversational assistant, and some folks are calling these co-pilots agentic as well. And that might be fair if you can prompt the system via that chat to go do something agentic. But oftentimes, they kind of fall short in that regard, and it's not actually a fully production ready agentic system. And so, for us, what we've come to understand is that these agentic systems are systems that can achieve goals autonomously. And a sub component of that are things like planning, tool use, and self-improvement. So what we mean by planning is that when it has its objective and receives the input, it knows how to tackle it, and it tackles it in a sensible way. The steps are always like, the appropriate level of steps to be taken. In terms of tool use, it has access to tools that it needs to perform and achieve its goal. And these can be specialist tools based on the vertical application, or it can be general tools that are just helpful, like a calculator or a calendar. And then for self-improvement, then it can self-improve over time, but also in flow. It doesn't just consider its current context that's provided to it. It considers all the previous cases, as well as like during the run of the agent. If it learns something midway through the process, it can adapt and spawn new tasks based on what it sees. And, I think in terms of our own understanding at Inscribe, one kind of increased learning we've had is that, previously we would have said an agentic system is one which can achieve goals using tools and planning. However, just because a system can create a plan and has access to tools doesn't mean it's agentic. or like sufficiently agentic because it could just be producing terrible results and outputs. Like it's kind of easy to get a system to create a plan, but could be a terrible plan, or use tools, but they could be the incorrect tools. And so a key part of it is like a certain standard of performance. And I think that's what's coming into our own definition now at Inscribe is this performance needs to be good enough.
But yeah, I think the really important question to ask is like, what does this mean for fraud? Why is this useful? I think the best way to think about it is historically using a lot of these like supervised machine learning approaches. And even, there has been some success with unsupervised learning methods, but we've always had a constraint of having the requirement to have seen a lot of fraud before we can really act on trying to build a detection system to prevent it going forward. So this kind of like long tail of fraud has always been elusive for us. And we're now with fraud reasoning and these agentic systems have the possibility to catch it. And you can kind of think of it as historically we've had to have this kind of one-to-one relationship between here's a certain type of fraud and here's a detector or detection system that can catch that type of fraud. Whereas with fraud reasoning, we can think of it as a one-to-many system where we have our kind of system prompt plus our various tools. And with those combinations, there's many types of fraud that the fraud reasoning system could catch. And this is particularly useful because it opens up an opportunity to catch fraud that isn't very common or we may not have seen at all. So for example, if there is like a new fraud ring or a new type of fraud that we haven't necessarily seen before, this will be able to react to that using a more generalizable form of detectors. Secondly, as well, it's also more economical and technically feasible. Without lots of data, it's often not technically possible to train a model on it. But with this approach, again, we hope to resolve that. A great example of fraud reasoning versus our traditional supervised and rules-based detectors is the simple detection of incorrect dates. So if you take an example bank statement where the starting and ending balance are, start of June to end of June, but then we see transactions in the bank statement that correspond to July or August or September or some other period outside that window. Historically, we would have had to build a dedicated detector that would look at all those various dates, and we'd have to essentially program the logic such that, check if this date exists outside the statement's range dates. However, in the future, with fraud reasoning, we can just simply give it access to, a calendar tool plus a prompt to say, check the dates on this bank statement, and it will check all the various combinations of dates and understand the underlying context that transactions should be within the range of the statement dates. And this is, of course, is a very simple example, but if you extrapolate this to all the different ways fraud can occur and all the different types of tools that we can build, you can see how this can get quite powerful and allow us to catch significant more volumes of fraud than we've been able to catch before.
That is so cool because the first LLM empowered functionalities we created Inscribe, like enhanced document understanding using LLMs to parse documents and understand documents specifically, like a utility bill versus a bank statement, but also the applicant context with our web search and cross-document checks. Those are really cool in themselves and very advanced, but now those are just tools that like our agent will use as part of its overall process. And with reasoning, the ability to understand the underlying context, i.e. everything you're looking at is in the context of fraud investigation right now, and assess things in that context is just really, really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what's most exciting here too as well. It seems like we're embarking on a new way of building fraud detection systems that can uncover emergent fraud patterns that we've never seen before. And what's really fascinating here is just seeing this being applied in other industries too and having initial signs of success. So whether it is in the world of physics or biology, we're seeing some really interesting research uncovering new patterns and new diagnoses that doctors haven't been able to find before, and researchers, but also, over the last couple of weeks, seeing DeepMind and OpenAI solved, previously deemed almost impossible math Olympiad questions for a reasoning model to solve itself. So yeah, I think we're on the verge of something very interesting here. And yeah, we're leading the way on the fraud side.
I'm glad you brought up where these type of agentic systems and reasoning are showing up in other fields, because I was reading an article last night. I'll put it in the show notes. And it immediately made me think of our work in this area on fraud reasoning. The TLDR is that physicists at Emory used a neural network not to predict or label, but to discover new physical laws governing a many-body system. Not only did the model infer non-reciprocal forces with 99% accuracy, but it also corrected long-standing assumptions in the field, which is very interesting. What really stuck out to me is the AI, which I mentioned was a neural network, had to work with very limited, messy, real-world data. It was designed to respect underlying constraints like symmetry while remaining flexible enough to surface new insights. And most importantly, it produced findings that were validated through experimentation. And so what that made me think of is, in a sense, we're operating in our own many body system, not plasma particles, obviously, but millions of signals across documents, web search, public entities, context. And like in that experiment, fraud doesn't allow clean rules. It's nonlinear and dynamic. Traditional assumptions often fall short, like metadata, automatically equals trustworthiness. But with the right constraints, signal architecture, and feedback loops, agentic systems can infer patterns, even patterns no one's explicitly trained them on. So I feel like this kind of cross-domain evidence suggests that there's a lot more to be discovered here, which is very exciting. Now it's time for our new closing segment, which is our Document Fraudster of the Month. I am a really big true crime fan. And so I watch fraud documentaries all the time. And every single fraud case involves documents, you guys. Every single one.
I think it makes it more of a tangible thing. We often talk
It
about
does.
fraud as it's like this overall fraud losses per year. But even we talk about it in a very numbing way as well internally. We're like, oh, fraud has occurred again. But like we catch thousands of fraudsters per week now.
Yeah.
But like there's a very compelling story behind every one of them.
Yeah.
And this is like one example.
These stories are everywhere, and it's our goal to just sort of highlight them and continue educating the community on how document fraudsters operate and how this fraud occurs. For this week, we are talking about John Dixon. John was the former head of tax at EY. For those of you who don't know, that's a Big Four accounting firm. And in 2004, he was caught forging legal documents during bankruptcy proceedings. What type of documents did he manipulate? 6 declarations of trust, 1 forged loan agreement, and all of these templates he downloaded from a law firm website, and he even added that law firm's branding to make them look legitimate. The judge was not fooled. He called it a deliberate artifice, noting how the documents had unusual language, suspicious timing, and weren't backed by any real financial transactions. That sounds like document understanding and applicant context. But what makes this story so relevant is that he didn't need any special tools. He used basic templates, edits, and confidence. Imagine how much more convincing those documents might have been if he had used Gen AI to write the language, format the documents, generate metadata, or even just create the whole thing from scratch. So yeah, a very interesting story. Good lesson in that, like, as fraud fighters, we just can't look at, whether a form field is filled out. We really have to understand each document's structure, logic, and intent to be able to verify that it's authentic and really defend the trusts of documents as an artifact.
Yeah, I think what's most alarming here is just this person's comment that it was a normal practice in, big firms and the auditing world. So if the people supposedly giving their stamps of approval over data and trusting it are also the ones committing the document fraud, that's not a very strong vote of confidence in their ability to perform audits and be arbiters of truth.
You can also just add as well how helpful it is to talk about these stories to ground, fraud in real scenarios. Oftentimes we can only talk about fraud in terms of holistic aggregated data. Like, for example, how many fraud incidents occurred per year or total fraud losses per month. But they oftentimes are consisting of thousands of individual stories. And a lot of them are like this. A lot of them are very varied as well. So yeah, just great to shine a light on how fraud can occur to make sure other folks are vigilant as it arises.
Absolutely. Especially because we see document fraud across so many different types of industries and situations. So it's something that we're constantly monitoring and want to make sure that we're highlighting and continuing to educate the market on. Well, that is it for today's episode. A huge thank you to you both, Conor and Ronan, for helping us unpack how fraud and fraud prevention are evolving in the Gen AI era. If you are as fascinated by this space as we are, you can always feel free to dive deeper on our website or DM any of us on LinkedIn. We're happy to chat anytime or answer questions, because at the end of the day, that is how we move forward, staying curious, challenging assumptions, and as always, asking good questions. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.